and thank you for joining today's webinar. This is Tom Banke with Forward Community Investments, and we're excited to have you join us for today's presentation. Before we get going, I'd like to take this opportunity to share the background of how we got here today. Forward Community Investments is celebrating their 20-year anniversary in 2014. FCI transforms Wisconsin communities by supporting organizations and programs that reduce racial, social, and economic disparities. We have strengthened these communities by offering affordable, flexible loans and expert advisory services that allow organizations to grow sustainably. Our loans, advisory services, and recently added grant fund give FCI the tools to encourage and support initiatives that make positive changes possible. Organizations need resources of all kinds, along with the skills and tools to manage them. Technology, volunteers, strong board governance, and financial acumen can provide some answers, but an important first step is to identify these assets and needs. Then determine what works best and what we can do better. We can help you to figure out where you stand and how to get there and where you want to go. With the help of BMO Harris Bank, we are able to offer this series of webinars to build nonprofit effectiveness. BMO Harris Bank is an active partner in Wisconsin communities and demonstrates strong corporate citizenship as an important part of whom they are and how they approach the community. Volunteerism and corporate responsibility are also key parts of the culture at BMO Harris Bank, and it's how they demonstrate their commitment to the investment in the communities they serve. We would like to thank BMO Harris Bank for their sponsorship of this series. Right now, we'd like to go through some housekeeping reminders on how to effectively use the GoToWebinar software. You can join the webinar using the telephone number that's provided in your confirmation email that was sent via GoToWebinar, or you can use your computer speakers, which is recommended by the GoToWebinar software. If you have questions throughout the webinar, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So we'll be taking them throughout the webinar. You can submit them using the chat or questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. Right now, we'd like to enact our first poll of the day. We'd like you to answer the following poll that is appearing on your screen now, asking, what is your role in the organization that you're representing? So we'll give a little bit for everybody to answer those questions. Looks like we've got the majority of those attending are staff members. Coming right behind that, we've got some executive directors, board members, and then some other staff. And there's also a chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen. Right now, we'd like you to enable using that by entering your name and your organization in that chat box. Great. Now that we all got those tasks out of the way, I would like to turn it over to our Vice President of Advisory Services, Dennis Johnson, to set the stage for today's webinar.
Great. Thanks, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today's presentation is really around an introduction to systems thinking for social change. Michael Goodman was part of a project that we were working with the Oshkosh Area Community Foundation, supported by J.J. Keller and also the U.S. Venture Fund up in Oshkosh earlier this year. So many of us have gotten an introduction to Michael and to some systems thinking concepts, and we really wanted to take that forward by bringing some of that learning to the broader Wisconsin community. What we did early in January and February was to have a three-part impact series that we titled, in support with Oshkosh Area Community Foundation, Tackling Wicked Problems. And when we talk about wicked problems, we're talking about poverty, we're talking about homelessness, we're talking about inadequate access to health care. Really, we're talking about those complex, seemingly what we refer to as kind of big picture, big community challenges that are really overwhelming public services and putting even greater pressure on communities and the organizations to meet some of those basic needs. So in tackling wicked problems, we are encouraging all voices at the table. We're looking for problem solutions from both the nonprofit sector, from the government sector, from education, healthcare, business, socially minded businesses, faith-based communities, and philanthropy to really join in a conversation to begin to create a common language and a common framework that really starts to look at solutions to some of these really large, messy, and wicked problems in our communities. So Michael kicked off the Tackling Wicked Problem Impact series with systems thinking. And to give you just an introduction to what systems thinking is about, it's really a language for describing and understanding the forces and the interrelationships that shape the behavior of systems. So Michael is an internationally recognized speaker, author, and practitioner in the fields of systems thinking, organizational learning and change, and leadership. And he's pioneered many innovations in the field of systems thinking that have made it more accessible for organizations like on the phone today. And he's been a practitioner in this work for nearly 30 years. So Michael's going to walk us through some of these concepts and some of the nomenclature. And as Tom was just mentioning, we would really encourage everyone's participation. If you have questions, if you have comments, please feel free to put those into the chat feature or the Q&A as we move along. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael. Good afternoon, Michael.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Dennis. And if I can see if I can get control here, show my screen. Okay, I'm sometimes technology disabled. All right. Show my screen. So should I go to my screen? Let me see here. Can you see my screen?
Not yet, Michael. We did give the controls over to you, so you should be able to get it. If not, we'll just kind of take things on our end, and we can run the presentation from our side.
Okay. Let me know when if and when it comes up.
Okay.
It doesn't show my screen. Oh, are we on? Or no?
No.
All right. I think rather than me fooling around with it, for some reason I can't show my screen. I'll just have you click away for me.
Okay, that sounds great.
So good afternoon, everybody, and I'm glad to be here. I have precious little time to talk about a very big subject, but I will do my best. I have, I think, more slides than I have minutes, so that means I'm going to talk really fast. However, I will try to make something sensible out of this, and hopefully reserve a few minutes at the end for questions, thoughts, or anything else. So if we could, let's go on. Click ahead. Yes. Can I click? Nope. You. Tom, you still there? Hello. Do we lose audio? Oh boy. Okay. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, Mike.
Hi, Mike. We accidentally lost phone connection, so we are back live now.
Okay, with me or with everybody?
With everyone.
Okay. Shall we see if we got people here with us?
It looks like there's about 62 people on the line, Michael, so I think we're good to go.
Okay, so apologies everybody, we're having a few little technical glitches here. So I will keep going here. So one of the things about systems thinking that I think people understand just from the words alone is we're talking about systems and we're talking about thinking, and I'm going to go into some of the tools in a bit. But the idea is we know that the problems in the organization are interconnected, that it's not so easy these days to put blame on another part or other stakeholders, that we're all connected in various ways. And one of the principles of systems is that systems are not broken. In fact, they are just perfectly designed to produce the results that they produce. So stay tuned to this. Let's move ahead. You click next slide here. Am I still on? Am I still on?
Yes, you're on.
Oh, okay.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, I can. Okay,
Great.
so some of the things that tell us that there's something more that we don't understand or we're not seeing are these kinds of observations that somehow when we address symptoms, we're not really getting at the problem. We all know this one. Let's move ahead. That it's very easy in the short term to make progress, but it seems like all that gets reversed in the long term. These are all different aspects of systems that we've encountered in our lives. That the things that happen that are what we'll call negative or problematic were never intended. They seem to be something about unintended consequences. Go ahead. And when things happen, it sort of seems to be the problem's out there, that the problem's not with us. So my purpose here is really to just introduce system thinking in a very light touch. There's a lot of content here. I'm really focusing on what it is and how it can be helpful to us. Go ahead. So first thing I want to do is a little bit of contrasting, kind of continue where we are with what the sort of traditional or typical thinking versus what I'll call systems thinking. And then, go ahead, you can just kind of move through these, Tom. I want to look at the roots of the field. Very briefly, I don't want to turn this into a history lesson. Why should we bother with this systems thinking stuff? A few more observations about systems, a very brief look at some of the tools, even a few little cases, and then end with other resources that are available to you. And as I mentioned, hopefully a little bit of time for Q&A. So let's keep going. So realize in this very compressed time, we're going to be as if we were in Fred's driving school class, learn to drive in just 5 minutes. Go ahead. How can you teach driving in just 5 minutes? Whoop, go back one. It's a crash course. So you're getting a very crash course. And crashes, also other kinds of crashes, like technical crashes. So we're going to have a variety of crashes here. So let me contrast. Go ahead. You can kind of just move through them, Tom. So let me contrast two different kinds of thinking. What I'll call conventional thinking. And conventional thinking is really about works fine most of the time. How we typically think or traditionally think works fine for relatively simple problems where cause and effect are obvious. But when we get into any kind of complexity, and as Dennis mentioned, messy problems like the kind most of you are dealing with, conventional thinking may fail us, may be insufficient. What we really need is a set of tools that can deal with the messiness, with the wickedness of the problem. Good? So let me do a few contrasts here. So in conventional thinking, there you go. One aspect of that is that it's relatively easy, or at least we think we know where the source of the problem is, and it seems obvious to us. In systems thinking, that relationship starts to break down. It's not obvious where the problem is, when it's not obvious where cause and effect is, and something else is needed. All right, go ahead. Reminds me of this cartoon. And this, for me, is probably the best cartoon of all in systems thinking. You'll see I like using cartoons. And this one is about how you and I are under pressure to take action. We're expected to take action. We're expected to be proactive. We do take action. It looks effective, at least short term. If you look at the dominoes starting to fall, it looks like you've made progress. Unfortunately, we don't necessarily see or have tools that enable us to see the whole. And sometime later, usually sometime significantly later, we may find ourselves in even a bigger problem as those dominoes come crashing down. Okay? So let me do a couple more of these. So one aspect of conventional thinking is the belief that there's someone to blame. So if you look, and I think this is probably particularly true in government, I think it's probably as true in nonprofits, and probably even in the corporate world as well, which is when there's a problem, we go often to who's messed up, who's screwed up, who's not on board. We're looking for blame. It might be an individual, it might be a group of individuals, and what we know in systems thinking is, you know what, it's not that people don't screw up, but if that's our primary source of problem solving, good luck. Then we might not be so puzzled to why we keep solving and resolving the same problem over and over again. As long as we personalize it, or mostly personalize it, we may not make real progress and understand what's really going on. All of us may be contributing in ways we don't fully understand. Go ahead. In conventional thinking, the belief is that what we do short term is going to help us long term. Reasonable belief. We probably wouldn't do things if we knew long term they're going to be problematic. But one of the things we know about systems, and this is from research now that's over 60 years in the making and beyond, is most of the things what I'll call quick fixes either don't make any difference, or actually in the long run, or may actually make things worse. Okay? Oh, and of course, one thing we'd love to do is, have some sort of a quick fix that is long term. Unfortunately, from what we know with all the research and work that's been done in systems thinking, is long term and quick fix don't go together. Okay? Here's another one. And this one I was trained as an engineer. I have an engineering background. If you've got a difficult problem, let's work on the pieces. Let's make sure the pieces are optimal or perfect. And in systems thinking, in contrast, it's not about the pieces. It's about the connections and the relationships. Here's another one. Some of you may experience this for yourself, which is that, well, we know this is a messy or complex problem. Let's just try a whole bunch of things, and hopefully something will work. A bunch of initiatives aimed at making things, all well-intentioned, all aimed at trying to make things better. Reality is there may be actually only a very few things that are going to make a difference, and the trick is to find those few things. And mostly what we know is it ain't easy to find what we call those leverage points. Okay? So a little bit about the field of systems thinking. Go ahead. You can just kind of go through all the slides here. Thanks. Basically, the field goes back to a Professor J.W. Forster, who turns out was my thesis advisor, and God bless him, is in his 90s, still around. Some 60 years ago, brilliant engineer. His early work, ironically, given our audience here, was actually in inner city renewal. At the time, Johnson's famous War on Poverty, and came out with a book called Urban Dynamics. with Mayor John Collins, former mayor of Boston, and that really moved Jay from the corporate world into the urban world, into the social systems world. Another notable piece of work that he's connected with was the Limits to Growth. Some of you may remember this. This was in the early 70s. This foretold a lot of the very things we're seeing today, only it underestimated how bad things were going to be. And this was 30, 40 years ago, so interesting there. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Peter Senge, who has probably single-handedly popularized this methodology and words like organizational learning, fifth discipline. Some of you may have found this book. This first one came out in 1990, and I guess this latest was 5 or 6 years ago on sustainability. So there's about a half a dozen books out on the subject. Peter and I are contemporaries. We both had Jay Forrester as our advisors way back when, okay? So why systems thinking? So you can go through these, Tom, you can lay out the whole set here. Great. So one of the things that people find helpful about systems thinking is that it starts to uncover those invisible, often unintended consequences that I've mentioned. It certainly enables us to think differently about the system we're part of. And it can be helpful, particularly when you're thinking about strategy or change efforts, to enable us to put the voice of the long term into the actions of the short term. And it's not about, this methodology is not about coming out with a perfect answer. It's about opening our choices so we see what the trade-offs are and we can be smarter and wiser about what we do. Okay? So some observations, some more observations about systems. My favorite cartoon, some of you may be familiar with this. It's the Sufi story, The Blind Man and the Elephant. Go ahead. Build. Go ahead. So a group of blind men to find an elephant and come back with a description of it. And so one of the blind men who landed on the leg thought that the elephant is like a tree trunk. And another one thought it was like a snake. The one on top, go ahead, Tom. There it was like a brush. And one more at the back thought it was a rope. Stop there. Can you click one more time? There you go. So the question is, who's right and who's wrong? Everybody has a valid perspective. There actually was a fifth blind person who had a very different perspective that was a little bit more soft and mushy. But you tell me, which of these views is the correct one about the elephant? And I think the answer is, well, they're all wrong. I think more appropriately, they're all incomplete, because I think, frankly, one could argue from the perspective of the trunk that it's like a snake, or from the perspective of the rope, of the tail, it's like a rope. All those are valid perspectives. It's just that nobody has the exclusive, or nobody sees the whole. And part of the value of thinking systemically together is for the pieces to come together so we can see them differently than we would as individuals. Go ahead. So there are, and I'm not going to go through all of these. Go ahead, you can go through I think there's like, that's it, good. So there are a number of laws that have come out of this work that I want to highlight. So in the middle or the top, there's a law of unintended consequences, which is things that look kind of obvious to do may have some very non-obvious, even surprising consequences. And the deal here is that those consequences, unintended consequences, usually don't show up right away. That is a property of systems or complex systems, is there's delays between cause and effect. And also there's dispersal in terms of between cause and impact. So it might be someplace else. There's another one, another observation about the law of worse before better and vice versa, which was typically what we find, that what works well in the short term actually is going to not be so good in long term. And the good news is vice versa. And Another one that you might find interesting is what we call the law of compensating feedback, which is the harder you push, the harder the system pushes back. And I bet some of you will recognize this one. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So other elements about what we know, other dimensions of what we know about systems and their properties is that most systems naturally resist change, no matter how well-intentioned the efforts. And it's not because people are out to resist change. It's not that we're inherently don't like to change. It's actually, we know there are forces and pressures that operate that pretty much cause the system to produce the results that it's producing, I think as Dennis defined so well. And so if you don't get at those things, it looks like people are just resisting change, when in fact, it may be that the system itself is resisting change. The third bullet point there, I kind of mentioned before, a property of system is that things are displaced in both time and space, which makes the problem, makes the challenge of dealing with complex systems a big one. Bottom line, and in red there, is you know what? In all the years that Peter and I and other people in the field have been doing this, one of the best ways to begin to shift how the system works going forward is the collective recognition of how the system is working now, i.e. becoming aware of the system itself begins to shift it. Very powerful sort of zen of systems thinking, okay? One of my favorite cartoons. I don't have any solution, but I certainly admire the problem. And one of the things that we did in Oshkosh, as Dennis mentioned, in our workshop on wicked problems, was really get people into the place of totally admiring the problem. That we don't like dealing with things that are a little bit more complicated. We have a habit of trying to simplify and sort of looking at what we can grab onto. And one of the real challenges in doing this work is our ability to sit back and just admire the problem. Go ahead. So you can go through this whole list and I'll talk about it. Yeah, so what makes for a good systems thinking issue? One is there is a history. What this methodology tends to do best is to look back at all the information we have, the history we have, because that becomes the basis for us to determine what are those forces and pressures we keep talking about. Another element of what makes for a good systems thinking issue or challenge is that we have actually tried to fix things before and it just hasn't worked. Obviously, that if we don't care about the issue, it's not going to matter much to us. So it's important that this is critical that this is important to us personally, but also organizationally. We have knowledge, we have data, we know about the issue, or at least some of the symptoms, and hopefully we have some influence or control over it, even if it's only to figure out how to respond. And the bottom line here is what makes for the best kinds of systems thinking issues are that we recognize there is a bigger story here. There's more going on. We don't know necessarily what it is. We have some thoughts, but this is a set of tools that helps us get to the bigger story. Go ahead. So these are, what you're seeing here is a list of some of the more recent, with the exception of the homelessness work that I did, work that I have done personally, and I'm not certainly the only one doing work with systems thinking and development. There are others, but the work that I have done recently, well, a few years ago, was with homelessness in Calhoun County. That's Battle Creek, Michigan. Most recently, just finished it, of some work I did with housing, entrepreneurship, and leadership in rural settings, and that was with Falk County. Did some work in rural nursing, again, in South Dakota, both of those, sorry, Falk County, South Dakota. Did some work with a group of a statewide group gathered to look at rural nursing and the needs and the opportunities there. And about, I don't know, 6 months ago, I did some work with Trenton, New Jersey in their downtown renewal efforts. And all of these, I applied, or we use systems thinking to help out. You'll see, I'll show you a little bit of the top two if we hopefully get to it here in a few minutes. Okay? So I wanted to just do a little show and tell on some of the tools. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. We don't have a lot of time to spend, but just to give you a little bit sense of what these tools look like. So why don't we go through them? So first set is loops. Go ahead, Tom. Go ahead. There we go. Oh, forward. There you go. So you can go ahead and do this whole slide here. Thank you. So one of the big underlying ideas of systems thinking is that the world works in feedback loops. It's circular. It's not linear. And so what we might think is just it's something we just need to act on. Actually, if you step back and look longer and look wider, we may recognize that how we respond, how we react, the actions and interventions we take may actually generate unintended and delayed consequences that could perpetuate or even worsen the thing we're trying to fix. So we're shifting from a sort of linear view to a circular view of the world. Go ahead. And it turns out, you can develop the slide, there are two building blocks in this work, and the good news is there's just two building blocks from which we can create more complex stories. One of them is what we call reinforcing loops, and I'll go through those in a second. Those you would recognize as vicious or virtuous cycles, circles. And the other is balancing loops or corrective processes. And as far as we know, in the known universe, those are the only two kinds of feedback loops that are out there. Okay? And what we know about then all living systems is that they're going to be combinations of reinforcing and or balancing processes. And again, you'll see a little bit of that as we go forward. Go ahead. So let me talk about reinforcing processes. You'll recognize words like virtuous cycles or vicious treadmills. And over time, when you look at history, you would know there's a virtuous or a vicious cycle through two very distinctive and more or less opposite patterns. Virtuous, usually virtuous, but might be virtuous for you, may be vicious for me, but typically where things are getting better and better and growing, that's going to be a reinforcing loop. We'll call that a virtuous cycle. Here I've drawn revenues over time. But you can also have a crash and burn. So something you don't want to see happening, but it does, which is quality of service getting worse and worse and worse, which we could easily characterize as vicious. Go ahead. And if you look at, here's a little story. This was Ben Bernanke, you know this guy. This is the story. Go ahead. There's two more elements here. This was a story that I found, I think, literally on the front page of the Wall Street Journal a few years ago when we were experiencing the economic meltdown. And it was literally, I took his words, which were, over whatever, a couple hundred words, and turned it into a diagram. And the story here, if you start at the top, is with foreclosures, which were starting to happen, as you know, meant that the impact on neighborhoods and cities was taking house values, which meant people no longer had their nest egg intact, or at least could no longer use their house as an ATM machine, which meant people got very nervous, got very conservative, and frankly didn't have nearly the kinds of spare change around to spend as much as they'd like, so people cut back spending. Of course, people cutting back spending means there's less demand and less sales for organizations, and so layoffs start to go up. And those layoffs are also part of disappearing jobs. And of course, as people lose jobs or reduce their working hours, or now, as we know, facing lower pay than ever, means a good chance there's going to even be more foreclosures. And this dynamic, this vicious cycle, up until recently was pretty powerful. I think most people knew about it, maybe even experienced it. Go ahead. Let me talk about the other building block. Mention this business of balancing processes. And if you look at the trend in balancing processes down in the bottom or the middle of the page, you can see very different. Here, instead of growing forever or declining rapidly, here it looks like we're trying to get someplace. It's bouncing around for sure, but it's trying to close a gap. It's trying to get to a target. And balancing processes are just that. They're regulatory kinds of loops. They're control. They're trying to adapt. They're trying to close the gap between some sort of a target or desired state and the current value, the current state. And they tend to resist change, which I'll maybe talk about in a little bit. So let me go to the next slide here. So you know about thermostats? Thermostats are perfect examples of balancing loops. So, and again, you're seeing a picture of them, and of course most of us are pretty familiar with the story behind this, which is when the room is too cold or too hot, depending on the season, and I guess we're still mostly in the winter season, so I guess heating is a good one. So when the room is too cold, the heating comes on, room temperature goes up. Room temperature goes up, we'll eventually get to our desired setting. When the room temperature hits our desired setting, the heating comes off. Heating comes off, what happens to the room temperature, at least eventually? Well, likely to start to lose warm air, again, if it's cold outside. So the room temperature might start to drop. As the room temperature drops, different from what we set on the thermostat, the heating comes back on, room temperature rises, and this on-off effect is the cycle. And if you've ever stayed at the Econo Lodge, you'll know this one very well. Go ahead. If you take the concept of a balancing loop with respect to thermostats and apply it to how often organizations respond to financial pressure, you'll get an equivalent. You'll get like a thermostat. So here you see written as a little story: facing financial pressure, we cut back on costs. Often it's discretionary spending like travel or training. When we cut back on costs, those efforts hopefully actually reduce costs. And when we reduce costs, we reduce the financial pressure. So what you've got pictured here as a loop is the 25 words in the story turned into a picture. And so the magic and the simple idea here is when you are mapping or drawing these loops, what all you're doing is taking a story that we're trying to tell in words and turning it into a picture that we can all look at, and making it a lot clearer for us to understand our thinking, understand our assumptions, and also bring in our perspective on the elephant. So someone may see it this way, but other people may say, but wait a minute, there are other things we could do. There are other things affecting financial pressure, other things, so we can start to expand from here. But the idea is it's very much a visual language. We're taking words that we would speak, and we're turning them into pictures that turns out is a lot easier for us to deal with when we're trying to think together. Go ahead. So another set of tools, we call them archetypes. Think of these as templates. Go ahead. And it turns out there's about a half a dozen of these. I've just listed the top 3 or 4. And you can see by the naming of these, and again, archetypes are kind of a funny word. Think of it as a template. These are meant to be classic stories that seem to appear all over the place. You can go from one domain to another, from one company to another, one culture to another. And what we have done over the particularly last 15 or so years is begin to create a library of these classic stories, and the name is meant to give away the story. So fixes that backfire, or shifting the burden, or limits to success, or accidental adversary. So we're going to take a look at 1 or 2 of these. Go ahead. So this is, and stop right there. Oh, there you go. So just to give you a little preview of the notion of one of these archetypes, there's one called fixes that backfire. So the idea, if you look at the left there, is some sort of a problem, symptom, or pressure. We're trying to fix something is not right. With the thermostat, it's the room's too cold compared to what we wanted. With financial pressure is our spending is way out of line with our revenue. So there's something that's getting our attention that we feel is important to address. That leads to, over on the right in yellow, some sort of a fix, something that we know will work in the short term. It's not just any old thing. It's something that we believe is the right thing to do. Maybe it's something we've done in the past. Doesn't matter. It's meant to relatively quickly fix the problem symptom or reduce the pressure. In the thermostat example, it's to close the gap and get the temperature of the room back to where we want it to be. However, in a simple world, that would be a more or less complete story. But in a little more complex world, very often there's another side of the story. So if you click one more time, Tom, there you go. That the thing we did, the fix or solution that we adopted, we utilized to fix the problem, symptom, or pressure, very often can generate unintended consequences that actually make the problem worse, make the symptom worse, or even perpetuate it. The difference between the upper loop and the bottom loop is those little hash marks noted with delays by them, is that the stuff that happens on the bottom takes typically a lot longer to show up. So long sometimes that we forget where it came from, so it looks like stuff just happened, and we often miss the connection between the actions we had taken some time ago and the unintended consequences we're facing now. Go ahead. So stop right there. So this one, by way of an example, is one I heard from NPR, which I listen to a lot because they're great system stories, unlike some of the other news stations or news programs. So there was an interview with a company that was having all sorts of problems with their health insurance costs going through the roof. And so after hiring a consultant, not me, but hiring a consultant and getting some help, they decided to raise their co-payment, which in fact certainly reduced the company's overall health insurance costs, what I'll call a quick fix. What do you think might have been an unintended consequence of that didn't show up for actually quite a while? Well, go ahead, Tom. One of the things that they cited as happened was that the number of visits by people needing frequent care monitoring on people with heart problems, people with diabetes, people with chronic illnesses, because it was more expensive now for them to go to the doctor, they started reducing their visits, waiting longer to see the doctor. Consequence of that, go ahead, was a lot of them got into trouble and had to head to the emergency room or even get hospitalized, which of course, go ahead, meant that costs, particularly due to treatment, went up. And so while they saved on co-payments, they more than made it up on treatment. If you hit it one more time, Tom, the interesting aspect of this is this stuff didn't show up the day they decided to raise co-payment. It took months. In fact, I think they said a couple of years before they realized that instead of their insurance costs going down as it had started to over the last, I think, 18 months, it actually started going up and was higher than when they started. And the result of that was that outside red loop. That's what we call, go ahead, click one more time, I think it's there. Yeah, that's the unintended consequence of what looked like an obvious thing to do. Let's just raise co-payment, people can afford it, and that will reduce our costs. Not fully taking into account the unintended consequence in red shown. Go ahead. Reminds me of this cartoon. Even though it's a very capable team, sometimes our solutions don't exactly play out as we had thought. Go ahead. Or I used to do some work with Caterpillar, and I always wanted to put CAT on the cab here. Go ahead. Let me show you another tool. I think we're okay on time. And you may be having questions, and hopefully Tom, Dennis are keeping track of whatever questions. If you've got them, type them in, and we should have a few minutes to deal with those. Let me show you one other set of tools that I've had great success with, particularly recently with those the South Dakota communities I mentioned before. So Falk County is in South Dakota, and we have been working about 1.5 years with 2 different communities in Falk County. And I realized that the tool, which we call Stock and Flows, would be a great application. So just to give you a quickie on this, this is about bathtubs. And I will make the connection between bathtubs and entrepreneurship in a minute, I promise. But the idea is you've got water flowing into the bathtub and you've got water flowing out of the bathtub. And as far as I know, the only way to change the level of water in the bathtub is either by adding more or removing it, either through the drain or, in the case of inflow, turning on the tap. That's how bathtubs fill up. Sometimes, of course, they spill over, so that's another way to getting outflow, but the idea is you've got flows that come in and flows that go out. If you take that basic concept and apply it to entrepreneurship, you'll get something like this. Go ahead. So these communities were very keen on encouraging community entrepreneurship, but basically to encourage startups in their community. And so they were focusing on how they might get some money, seed money, encourage entrepreneurs to go into business, even if it's just themselves and their wife and with their family, but just to encourage as much startup as possible. And so they were pretty much focused on this side of things. What we did through discussions is kind of add some more to the story here. So go ahead. So it turns out that, businesses, once you're in startup mode and you're kind of off the ground, then you can go to what's called stage 1 businesses. And I guess there's a lot of academic work about this. And that's basically when you actually start hiring employees. You're creating jobs. But it may only be, 1 to 10 employees or something like that. But eventually, if that business is successful, go ahead, you get to what's called stage 2 businesses, which are now, hundreds of employees. And if you're really doing well, we get to stage 3. Go ahead. Stage 3 are, pretty big businesses now, the kinds in all communities wish they had thousands of employees, really creating jobs and providing good employment for the community. And then go ahead. And then you get to the mega corporations like, the Intels and GMs. So the idea, of course, is that you want not just startups, but you want businesses to be able to move from startup mode to stage 1, stage 2, maybe stage 3, great if we can do stage 4, that'll take a little more time. But it's not just encouraging entrepreneurship, there's more to the story. Go ahead. And so, go ahead. So what I use this diagram for with the community group we were working with, who was focused on entrepreneurship, was looking at the inflows to each of those stages. Whereas they may have been only looking at startups, there's also the issue, well, how do you help a small family business move into a little bit larger where they might actually employ some more people? And how do you take the small businesses and turn them into even larger businesses? Rather, it's not just about startups, it's about growing, enabling and supporting smaller entities to become larger entities. Of course, that's where you're going to get your best job creation. So the issue for the community then is, what are the key factors that drive those inflows? Go ahead. And then there is issue, and what, as part of that, is what impedes movement. Why can't we more successfully move from startup to stage 1 or from stage 1 to stage 2? Then the other side of this is, we all know businesses fail. I think there's a very high failure rate. So what drives those? And what could we do to reduce, in this case, the outflow? So hopefully we have more startups succeed and are able to move into stage 1, and hopefully more stage 1 businesses don't go under and we can move to stage 2. So not only do you need to look at how do we move them from one stage to the other, we also need to look at how do we keep them from failing, from dropping off. Where are the bottlenecks? Okay. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. And the focus then of the work that this group of this group was, where do we need to focus our efforts, our precious resources? What do we focus on that's going to make a difference? So typically, as I say, mostly we look at the blue, turn on the tap here, but what they hadn't fully appreciated was we really need to, and we have lots of opportunity here that we hadn't thought about in helping those startups move to become bigger businesses, assuming they want to. Some, of course, don't, but many could or should or want to do that. So in green was, let's start looking at how do we help them make the transition, and then on the bottom is, what do we do to make sure they're sustainable? Go ahead. I won't show you the whole thing, but as we started to map out the system and looking at what are those drivers that enable us to keep them sustained, to move them from one to the other, we started to identify within the community what are the assets that they have that can help their entrepreneurs. And how do we mobilize those assets in terms of this stock and flow, the connected bathtubs, as they would describe it. Okay, go ahead. So, wow. I've talked really fast, so hopefully some of this makes sense. My last thing here, and then we'll open up for a little bit of Q&A, is there lots of material out there. Some of you may already be familiar with Peter Senge's books, as mentioned earlier. These are two I would highly recommend. There's some websites. I've got my own called Applied Systems Thinking. There's articles there. There's the Society for Organization Learning, which has lots of resources. There's online systems thinking courses. Lots of stuff here. You can pretty much get a PhD in this subject, as you could imagine. And so I will stop talking and start listening or taking questions.
Thanks, Michael. I guess one of the questions that we typically see is, where and how to get started. So if I'm running an after-school program and the challenge is resources are dwindling, there's more kids standing at the door that want to participate in our programs, and we're not able to serve perhaps the increased demand,
Yeah.
in that kind of example, where do we begin is kind of, I think, one of the questions that we typically see.
Yeah, so if it's a problem that it's felt like, so based on my criteria about what makes for a good systems thinking problem, challenge, is if there's some mystery here, if there's things we believe we don't understand, if it's not obvious to us in all parts of this, then I would say it would be appropriate to think about using these kinds of tools. If, on the other hand, it's just pretty much straightforward, we need to get, more budget, more facilities or more staff in order to accommodate. So the best place to start is with the right kind of problem that the community is facing. So classic ones would be like entrepreneurship, housing issues, youth development, crime, gangs. Those are, we know, there's many nuances, many dimensions, a little more complicated. Those would probably be ones that would lend themselves best to this methodology. So once we've identified the right kind of problem, then the question is, who are the right stakeholders? Because this work does not depend on an expert like me coming in and telling people, well, this is how it works and this is where you should fix it. All of the things I showed you all came from the community. This is all work that they provided. I just gave them a structure, kind of a methodology, and we used the tools. And they use the tools to come up with the stuff that I shared with you.
Great, thank you. I think Ben has a question as well.
One question that came up was, if we're providing programs now, how do we know whether we are on that short, quick fix loop, or if we're on one of the longer-term unintended consequences? What are good ways to see if we're making real progress once we kind of identified that system?
Yeah, so I guess the question is, there's suspicion that there may be unintended consequences? If there's some suspicion, and maybe more than suspicion, some data, So again, another element of what makes for the good issues to take on with these tools is where we have some history, where we do have some experience. Doesn't mean that we have collected data, hard data, but we've got enough experience, even if it's only anecdotal, to tell us what we thought was a good idea may have some real problems here. When we sense that, then it's that's a good time to ask the question you're asking. Is this actually doing what we think it is? And again, it's the best way to take on that question is to ask the stakeholders, whether it's the providers, whether it's the clients, end users, to get to begin the process to poll and to inquire with the relevant appropriate stakeholders about what are they seeing.
Good, thank you. I think that covers a lot of it. And engaging with the stakeholders, those that are receiving the services, is something we're seeing more and more in kind
Absolutely.
of that human-centered design approach.
Yep. In fact,
if anyone else has questions, oh, pardon me, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I was just going to say the entrepreneur stock and flow that I shared ever so briefly had in the room about a half a dozen local entrepreneurs who were helping us think about how this works. So they were in the process, as an example.
Wonderful.
Great. Well, doesn't look like there's any more questions, and we're getting close to our target end time. So in respect to everybody's busy schedule and things like that, we'll be wrapping it up. I'd like to please join me in thanking Michael for today's content and BMO Harris Bank for their support. The presentation that he shared was so valuable, and as with all of our webinars, the recording will be available for playback from our website. We would encourage all participants to review our website at forwardci.org for more information on how Forward Community Investments can help your organization. One last note, when you close your browser from this session, you will be directed to a very concise questionnaire to evaluate today's webinar. Please take a few minutes to complete and help us continue in improvement to improve the effectiveness of these offerings. And thanks again to BMO Harris Bank for making this learning opportunity available. And also I'd like to take some time to kind of plug our next session of this series. Will be taking place on Tuesday, June 10th at noon, same time. We'll be having Jeff Snell, who is a social innovation expert, speaking on how to accelerate social innovation into your community. So once again, you will be closing out your session, so please take some time to fill out that survey. We would greatly appreciate it, and hope you took a lot away from today's session, and we'll be in contact letting you know when and where you can access the recording to this webinar. Take care and enjoy the remainder of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome.